All right, we have sound now. Problem solved. That was the open broadcast software being a butthole. So, anyway, welcome. This week we're going to go over Landscape. Landscape is Unreal system for creating large open areas. Um, it's pretty fantastic. In Unreal 3, several games made good use of it. If you played the Borderlands series, they used it. Um, and it used to be fairly inefficient and had some problems. For example, in UDK, if you tried to have more than four materials in any one quadrant of your landscape, it would wipe out all of the materials on that quadrant. They have fixed most of those problems in Unreal 4. So we're just going to go ahead and get started talking about landscape. So to get there, it's over in your modes panel. It's the middle button here that looks like mountains or weird ice cream thingies. Uh, and so if you don't have a landscape, it's always going to initially start on the Manage tab. And whenever you open this up, you're going to see some of the same things. We're going to have our transforms here, and then our section size, our sections per component, number of components, overall resolution, and total components. So we'll go through those piece by piece and explain what each one of them mean. Um, you also have import from file up here and material. We're going to cover materials later. This is a number of different things. If you have like a default material you want to apply to the landscape, if you've created a material in something like World Machine, you can apply splat maps this way. But we're going to do it the awesome way, which is creating a landscape material, which I'll probably go over tomorrow. So looking at these different things, the location, rotation, and scale are exactly what they sound like. Location is just the X, Y, and Z coordinates of where it exists in world space. Um, the rotation, exactly what it sounds like. Scale, it always defaults to 100, and I believe that's because the default unit system in Unreal is centimeters. So one Unreal unit equals 1 centimeter. So multiplying that by 100 gives you meters. Um, the next section or the next part is section size, and section size is used for landscape, LOD, and culling. The smaller sections will allow your landscape to LOD more aggressively, but it has a higher CPU cost. So you're going to want to try and strike a balance between what you need your landscape to do. If you want to have a huge landscape, you're going to need to use larger section sizes because smaller sizes and scaling the landscape up, using a smaller size and scaling your landscape up is just going to have huge impact on CPU cost. So the next part is sections per component. And sections per component is what actually is going to help with your landscape LOD. Each section is kind of the basic unit for how the landscape LOD works. And then one component could have like 2 by 2 sections, which means that it's possible that one component could be rendering 4 different LODs at once. And if you don't really understand what all that means, don't worry, we'll go into it in greater depth probably during this stream. Um, with a larger section size, you also get the added benefit of reduced CPU calculation time, but you could run into issues with the landscape rendering way too many vertices at once. This is all based off a weird vertice system as opposed to quads like a lot of 3D modeling is. So that's why you get these weird numbers like 31 by 31 quads, because they're actually basing that off of the number of vertices that are in a single line. Um, this could be even like, and so some of the problems with the landscape rendering too many vertices at once could actually become even worse when using very large areas of landscape. What I recommend is start with something smaller because you can always create additional landscapes, and you can also always add more components and sections to a landscape that you've created. So the next thing we have down here are the number of components. And along with section size, this sets the size of your landscape. And the value is capped at 32 by 32 because each component does have a CPU cost. And going over this cap is going to, like, it's going to result in very bad performance overall. And the overall resolution is back to the vertices thing we were talking about. That's the total number of vertices that your landscape is using. And then The total components, this final grayed out one down here, is exactly what it sounds like. It's the total components used by that will be used to create your landscape. Fill world here. If I just hit that, you can see it makes the landscape literally as big as it can be. You're probably never going to need to do that. And what I would recommend is actually cutting down the number of components and the resolution to kind of the smallest. Oop, that's way too small. I think it was like at 180 something. Let's go 2 by 2 sections. Number of components, let's go like, I don't know, 20. 20 is a good start. Oh wow, that's huge. That's way bigger than I need. Oh, that's because down here this wound up being 1241 resolution. Let's make this 180 and 180. This is actually way too small. This is much smaller than we want to start with, but that's where we can start using our section size up here. So let's go 63 by 63 quads. I think I'm going to go back. Nah, we'll keep it at 2 by 2 sections. Number of components, I'm actually going to go 8 and 8. And this is going to give us a nice large. Damn, that's back to being way too big. For what we're doing, it's really not going to matter. Most of what we're going to be doing is sculpting. Let's cut this down again. There we go. That's going to be better. But as you can see, this is still like pretty geometry heavy. It's going to do a few things for us that are really nice, though. We're going to be able to sculpt some very high detail things in here. And there's some really great tools for the sculpting. So once you've got this set to how you want it, I am going to drop this. Let's drop this to like 200 resolution, or I guess 187. Fine, that'll be good enough. I'm going to hit create. And so now we have a landscape in here. And one thing you're going to want to pay attention to when you're sculpting is you can see these quads here. You're going to want to make sure that these don't stretch too much. And you can see what I mean right here. I'll just go ahead and sculpt this up a bit. And notice as I do, the quads start to deform and they get a lot bigger. This is going to affect how your textures and materials appear on here. And so what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to try and balance the amount of sculpting you're doing with how much your materials and textures are going to how much they're going to stretch across the surface. Because right now this is going to look really bad if we apply a material to this. We're getting some very odd stretching here. But let's go ahead and talk about our sculpting tools. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of flatten this back out. Oop. Let's go linear fall off and we'll stay on the circle brush. Oh, so I should probably talk about these tools here first. So first off, to sculpt, when you come in here, it'll automatically be on the sculpt tool, circle brush, and smooth fall off. And you can just use your mouse button, or this works with a Wacom pen and tablet, and it's awesome to do this with a Wacom tablet. So clicking anywhere in the area will begin sculpting, and it uses the Wacom tablet's pressure sensitivity. If you're not using a Wacom tablet, you can just hold down your mouse button and make big, giant, gross things like that. To push in on your landscape, you hold down Shift and sculpt over it, and you can see I'm starting to push this down more. So we have a bunch of tools though. We've got Smooth, which if we use this, it will average the distance between the verts and kind of create a smoother fall off. You want to be careful with using this tool. It will make your landscapes look rubbery. Like a good example is if you've played any of the old, like the original Star Siege Tribes or any old PlayStation 2 games or old Xbox games, the landscapes tended to have this kind of everything was very rounded and soft looking, and it's not necessarily always going to be what you want, but it is good for when you've been sculpting an area to try and get the quads unstretched a little bit. So the next tool we have in here is Flatten. And Flatten takes a point sample from one area and then will apply it to everything else you brush over. So if you need to flatten something off, or if you've made something too deep or too tall and you need to bring it back down, you just click on the height that you want something to be at, or something, a place in the landscape that is the height that you want, and then you can brush all over the landscape to get it back down. So for example, if I kind of make this big mess here and I decide I actually need a big plateau at the top of this and everything to be at the same height as this and be even, I can go back in, grab my flatten tool, position my cursor over where I want that flatten to happen and the height I want things to be. And then if I click on that, it will then flatten everything out to that level, which, again, may not always be what you want. Like in this case, this looks pretty gross. When we can come in here and we could smooth some of this out and try and knock down some of the overwhelming stretching that we have going on in there because it's really bad. Or in this event, it's actually going to be a lot easier to just grab my flatten brush and just knock it all back down to the same general size or level. So the other tools we have in here, we've also got our ramp tool. And for anyone who's ever had to sculpt landscape in Unreal, and especially in earlier versions, the ramp tool is a godsend. It used to be a nightmare to try and sculpt paths for players to walk up like mountains or whatnot, because in Unreal, a player can walk up I believe, a 60-degree incline, which visually does not look like you can walk up, but the game would let you. And it was really hard to get it nice and even, and especially if it was a long path. The nice thing about this is we've got our side fall off here and a ramp width here. So I can click to add my ramp points where I want them. So I've got these guys here. And then I just kind of pull on these handles to make the ramp the size that I want it to be and position it where I want it to be. And then I can pull up, and if I hit add ramp, boink, I have a ramp. And this is incredibly handy and very, very fast. This is so much better than the old way of doing this was to literally sculpt up your mountain or whatever you needed. I'll give you a quick example of what a nightmare that this was. So you would have your big area that you want the player to have to traverse. I'll just sculpt some more of this up to give me a little bit more to work with here. So you would have something like this, and you would need the player to get to the top, and you couldn't just carve away all the way up here. I'm going to drop my brush size quite a bit. Uh, so you would generally need to like come in here and start smoothing out some of these areas, um, sculpting them down quite a bit, and trying to get a decent path going. And you could almost never get it even, and depending on your fall off, you might wind up with weird flat spots or weird round spots and dips and divots and things that were just generally not only unsightly but didn't work very well and didn't look like the player could traverse them. And generally, whenever you're doing any kind of level design task, if it's someplace the player can go, you want it quickly visually apparent that the player can get there. And especially if it's, a vital place for them to get to, like they need to get through an area to get through the rest of the level. For example, if this was like a mountain pass they had to get through or something to that effect. Drop this to like 512. So the ramp tool made our lives a lot easier there, because you can imagine like this could take hours. And like if we come in here and look at just kind of what this was doing, we can see it sort of looks a little gross. It's not really that good. We're not getting a nice even sculpt. And even if I come in with something like the smooth tool, what winds up happening is we wind up undoing a lot of the work we just did. And we can knock that down by knocking down the tool strength here. I would generally actually go with the tool strength of, when you're just starting out, and you're not familiar with the tools yet and you're learning the finesse, I would start with something even as low as 0.15. It'll have a much lower effect, and you can kind of sculpt it up and down a little bit easier. And especially for the smooth tool, it won't have as great of an effect, and it'll make it easier to work with. So mostly what I wanted to talk about tonight was just sculpting landscape and sculpting like really big epic landscapes. It's harder to do than you would think. Like just having a landscape system doesn't automatically mean doing something like this is easy. In fact, to do this well is significantly more difficult than you would imagine. And the reason I like to sculpt this is things like World Machine will spit out landscapes for you, but they're not always very usable. And because World Machine and other generators like that do things off fractals, you have some control, but not very much. And generally, in game environments, you want a lot of control, unless it's gonna like World Machine's good for things where it's going to be just background and the player's never gonna have to walk on it. But I wouldn't want to use a World Machine landscape unless I absolutely had to, because it's going to be too much work to make it good and usable. I'd almost rather start with something flat, figure out where my different areas in here are going to be, like where the player is going to start, where my areas of interest are going to be. And usually, what I'll do, and if you've played Chivalry on Steam, you've seen this, whether you know it or not. They use the landscape system a lot in that. Is I come in and I start with a brush about 1024 in size. I will drop my brush fall off down to about a quarter. And then here is where I change my fall off a little bit. I might start with, we should probably talk about these. So smooth fall off, the you'll get kind of a nice rounded edge, but you'll still get straighter lines on the side. So if I just come over here and sculpt down, you can kind of see what's going on here. It's creating a curve from the center of the fall off area down to the bottom of the brush. If I come in and I change that to linear, I'm basically just going to create like a nice mound shape that's really hard to see. Excuse me. Spherical, exactly what it sounds like. You're going to start to get more spherical areas, although it's kind of hard to tell. There we go. And then the last one is tip, and this will cause the brush to actually fall off towards the tip of the brush. So um, you'll get essentially it'll kind of curve inward at the sides and up towards the brush tip. So I'm going to flatten these back out again, and then we're just going to get started. So one of the things that makes this nice is the Wacom tablet and the pen do definitely make this a lot easier. And so we're going to start at one edge, and I'm just going to kind of start making mountain masses, like where I want the mountains that are going to be in the background to be. So I'm going to grab my sculpt tool. I'm going to turn on use clay brush. If you're familiar with ZBrush at all, this is just like the clay brush in ZBrush. It's fantastic. I'm a big fan. Um, you can actually use patterns and alphas, and then a few other things. We'll get into a lot of that later. Right now, we're going to start with the basics. So I'm going to start just building this area up. And for this, I actually need to turn my tool strength up a little bit. Let's make that like 0.25. And I'm just going to start making brush movements with my Wacom tablet and pen, kind of build this area up. And just kind of start generating the mass of where there's eventually going to be a mountain. And I try to do this fairly evenly on all sides. One, as you stroke away from whatever part you're working on, you're creating some valleys and some of the other features that already exist in mountains. And two, you get a nice even spread. It gives you a lot to work with, and it keeps too much stretching from happening. And don't worry that it doesn't look very good right now either. I mean, that's kind of the point of this is like it's going to take some work to get there. Right now, we just kind of want to build up the mass of this to be able to get just, a nice mountainous area. So during this, you're going to be rotating the camera around a lot, and make sure you're not trying to do this. It's easy to get into a groove and try and do this all from one side, but when we do that, you can see what's happening here. We're not getting even brush strokes anymore. We're getting a lot of areas that are getting missed, or they're stuck in the fallout of the brush. So you're gonna definitely want to move the camera around a lot and make sure, like generally I always pull towards me on the Wacom tablet or on a mouse. Just kind of creating these nice lines here, and I'll just keep doing this to build this mass up. This can take a little while, but honestly, this is one of the most fun parts of landscape sculpting for me is the initial block out of it. It's kind of, I don't know, a Zen experience for a lack of a better way to put it. Um, Come back around. And a lot of this is going to depend too on what you're doing. A lot of games still don't use landscape systems. A lot of games will still model everything like in Maya or Max, because one of the advantages to that is that if you build everything in your 3D modeling program, you can make sure that your buildings and stuff sit flat in the areas you need them to. With a landscape system, you kind of have to work out those areas, and you don't necessarily want like large flat areas because it looks a little weird and unnatural. It takes a little bit more finesse, but I really do feel like you get a lot more power out of this, and especially when we get into landscape materials tomorrow, you'll see why. Landscape materials let you paint directly on the surface, and they're just really, really nice as opposed to traditional texturing methods. So let's stop talking and get this done a little bit faster because I want to get to some of the other tools that we get to work with. The erosion tools are particularly awesome. And I'm doing that thing I told everyone not to do. And this is another good reason why not to do that. As I was adding to this side from away from the camera, I wound up with these areas now that are all stretched out and kind of gross. So let's build up this center area some more because I can always smooth this out later. I'm being a little anal retentive about this. You can do this a lot faster than the way I'm doing it. But you can kind of see we're getting a bit of a build up where it's, I don't know, starting to look a little bit more like a mountain. I'm gonna change the brush size to 1024. Let's go 2048 and just double the size so we can get this built up a little bit faster. Your initial pass on any, especially things like mountains or any like big epic landscapes, don't really need to be too clean. You don't have to be too concerned about how precise you are. Um, what you really just need to be doing is making sure that you're blocking out the areas correctly and in the way that you want. Um, it helps if you've already got scale set up and you know the scale you're working in. You don't want to create giant huge mountains that the player has to traverse, and then find out too late that the player cannot traverse them. Not that it wouldn't be that hard to fix. It's just making more work for yourself, and that's just silly. We should never do that. So I'm going to build this up a little bit more. Actually, nah, let's build it up some more. We're just going to make one big giant mountain because why not? I'm actually going to give myself some more screen space to work with here. Since right now I don't really need a lot of my UI, but I do want more screen space. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of build up the middle area here where the mountain peak is going to be. And as it gets a little bit bigger, and now I'm just getting sloppy, but as it gets a little bit bigger, I'm going to lower the brush size. And then we're going to begin finessing this to make it look like what we want it to. Oh, wow, that's bad. Let's go over here and clean this up a little bit. Generally, when I do this, I'm going to take more time and I start with a smaller brush. Like I said, I'm a little anal retentive and perfectionist about it. A lot of the using a larger brush right now is just to get this um, blocked out a little bit faster. So I probably could have started with a larger landscape size too, but that's all right. So we're off to a pretty good start here. We've got this big landmass built up. So now is where some of the finesse comes in. So I'm gonna lower my brush size back down to 1024. And now I'm going to come in and I'm going to hold down shift and I'm going to start sculpting some of this down. And that the brush fall off is fine, but our tool strength is way too high. We're losing a lot of detail um, that we were building up. So hold down shift and come back in here. That's still, even with the lowered brush strength, it's still kind of taking much larger chunks out of that than I want. So let's knock that down even farther. Let's go 0.1. Come back in here. This is one of the problems that you can run into trying to use landscape to build big land masses is that it does get a little bit harder to work with. But if you're patient and you finesse it, you can actually still do quite a bit with it. A lot of what's happening now is it's similar to the smooth tool. It's averaging between vertices based on their distance from one another. And so the bigger the chunk that's being taken down, it generally means that there's a large distance between the vertices involved. Um, but this is kind of nice. It'll allow us to get a more natural mountain shape. I'm just going to keep sculpting this down. And once we get to the point where we're sculpting down a little bit, we might actually want to drop this brush size even more. I'm going to drop this down to, oh, no, not point. We'll drop it down to 512. Excuse me. I'm going to raise my brush fall off to about half or 0.5. I want a little bit more fall off here. And actually, because I'm because at this point I'm working on kind of sculpting things down a little bit, I might actually take the linear fall off brush here just to get kind of some of those nice grooves and things that you get in mountains that you see in mountains. We'll start just kind of giving this a little more detail and love here. I highly recommend that if you're going to do this, do it with do your sculpting with a Wacom tablet. It's going to make your life a lot easier. It's a little bit more fun, I think. And if you're used to ZBrush, this is going to be like second nature. A lot of it works identically, including hotkeys. So just kind of keep going here. I think I'm actually going to take the smooth tool and kind of hit this a little bit and try and smooth out some of these areas that are stretching. Um, just so the sculpting I'm doing will have the effect that I want. Because right now, what it's doing is essentially what the smooth tool would do, which isn't necessarily what I want. So I'm going to smooth these areas out a little bit. And you can see what I was talking about the smoothing, making things look a little bit rubbery. Like notice these areas I'm going over, they're getting rounded. The parts that we've sculpted in are kind of getting muted and lost. And that's okay. We're gonna fix all that in a minute just by sculpting over it. And this is always kind of a process to, you gotta. It's a lot like working with clay. So let's keep going here and get sculpted out a little bit more. Usually this is how I'll do this too. I sculpt everything up. I take the smooth tool and kind of try to get rid of jagged edges that I don't really want. I try and make sure that I get rid of as much stretching as I can. You're never going to be able to get rid of all of it. It's unfortunately just one of those things. Um, but you can minimize it. And then in your landscape material, there's a lot you can do to make that stretching less noticeable, and we'll talk about that later. So I probably don't need to worry about the backside of this because it's unlikely that anyone would see it based on where it is on this landscape. Um, and I mean, if that's the case, if this were if what we're looking at here was the back side of this and the player was never going to see it, I could essentially not worry about it, which is exactly what I'm going to do, is not worry about it. So let's just kind of sculpt this down a little bit more. So now let's look at some of our tools here. We've got the heat erosion tool or thermal erosion, and the thermal erosion tool is fantastic for making like sun-baked rock faces. So I'm going to grab this. This is one of my favorite tools. We've got a lot of cool settings here to play with. So, our usual, the brush size and brush fall off, our tool strength, our threshold. So, like it says here, the threshold is the minimum height difference necessary for the erosion effects to be applied. So, if we make this number smaller, it's going to have a much greater effect. If we make it bigger, it's going to look for areas where there's a much larger change in distance between height before it's going to take effect. Surface thickness is always a little bit weird, and I've never been quite certain what this actually does because I've adjusted this number a ton of times, but have never seen much noticeable effect. Then the noise mode is just like adding you can add noise, so you can either raise, lower, or both. Generally, I like to go with both. Lower will sometimes really cut into things, and so if we do both, what we wind up with here, I need to make this, actually that's way too big. Let's drop that down to like 20. And that all looks good, but we need to bump our brush strength up, or our brush size up, so it'll be more noticeable. So this also works a little bit like the smooth tool. It is going to average out the distance between vertices, but what this is going to do is it's going to apply these erosion effects to this. So as we go over this, and sometimes as you're doing this, you're going to see here we're getting these like huge changes, and that's as we adjust where the brush is and where the erosion is occurring, it's causing more stretching, so it has to do more work in order to get the landscape to work with it. So this is kind of a good way too to smooth out what you've done. Like rather than using the smooth tool, because as you can see here, it doesn't make things look rubbery. Instead, it's, we're starting to get kind of some rock face looking things going here. Come in and do this some more. The heat erosion tools are definitely one of my favorite. They make some really neat effects, and it's really easy to make things that look like big rock faces. Or I'll show you some more subtle tricks for making the most out of your landscape, and one of those are using tools like this on parts that are just at the player's height. They don't need to be these huge epic mountains. You can use this just to add a little bit more realism. For example, if you need like rocky areas, you can add that in your landscape as opposed to having to use a static mesh for it. And just kind of the general idea is if you're going to use something like the landscape, like use it to its maximal effect, like take the most advantage of it you can. So as you can see, we're starting to get something that actually looks like a mountain here. It took some work, but we're getting there. I'm going to keep going on this a little bit more. Um, I'm also like, because I'm using the Wacom tablet for this, I'm going really lightly over this. If I just press on this, the pressure sensitivity is going to turn this mountain into a volcano or a crater. I'm not really sure which. Probably both. So let's kind of get a little bit more over here. I'm trying to make some of those culverts that you get in mountains as like water flows down them. We got that going kind of a little bit there. Get something going over here that's similar. We can make this a little more mountainy. That's looking good. This top is bugging me. I want to fix this. And by fix it, I mean make it all chunky and rocky looking. Okay, so that's actually starting to look really, really good. But you can see what I mean about it being good for making things that look like rock faces. We're definitely starting to get some features that appear a little bit more rocky than they did before. And if you're sculpting and you're having a hard time, if you're having a hard time really kind of seeing what you're doing, you can apply materials to this. I tend to not do that. I'm used to this checker pattern and I like it because I can see where my stretching is and kind of get a feel for like how much stretching there is. But if I mean there's no rule that says you can't throw a material on there just to kind of have an easier time with your initial sculpting because you can always just put the default material back on to see how badly your stretching is if you can't see it in the material you have on there. Okay, well, you know what? I'm just going to keep working at this for a little while. Nice. Okay. Um, Actually, here, let's take care of this weird round spot over here. Actually, this might be a good spot to demo our other erosion tool. So our other erosion tool is hydro erosion. And hydro erosion is exactly what it sounds like. It's erosion from water, like rain, lakes, rivers, not lakes, but flowing water down a surface. This tool, you have to be a little careful with, and I'll show you why. Oh, actually, hey, they fixed it. Sweet. This used to cause really deep gullies. It would just dig into your landscape and leave these big pits in it. Um, so we should probably talk about a few of the tool settings over here. So rain amount is exactly what it sounds like. Amount of rain to apply to a surface. Larger values result in more erosion. Sediment cap is how much of the surface of the mountain or the landscape would get moved with that water erosion. So it sort of sculpts it down essentially and makes an area near the bottom where there should be a little bit more buildup based on those numbers. Iterations is just how many iterations of erosion it's going to do. Initial rain distance, it rains in some places or not others, but you could do positive or negative or both. And then detail smoothing. This is kind of important actually. Detail smoothing will actually remove details that you've sculpted in. So leaving that number low is good unless you want to Picasso the hell out of what you just did. If it isn't looking good, you can crank up detail smooth out all the stuff you've sculpted in, and then like kind of start over again. This tool you still want to be a little careful with though. And what I would actually I would tend to use this on smaller brushes. Let's drop that to like 512. And then I would use that in areas like this here where we've got this. Now there you're starting to see some of that pitting. Here we go. You're going to see it here. We're getting these areas where um, our sediment cap is moving but not very much. So we're getting like little pits in here. And to be completely honest, I don't really like the rain erosion tool that much. Um, I don't really feel like it does its job as well as it could. I honestly feel like the heat erosion tool does most of what this one's supposed to and does it better. But that's been the case since Unreal 3. This tool um, has never really worked terribly well. You wind up kind of fighting it, I think, as much as you wind up doing anything useful with it. However, it can be good for like small areas. Like, if I want an area where, it's clear that water has moved through there, it's going to be pretty good for that. But I could do essentially the same thing with just a regular sculpt tool. Side note, holding down shift while you're using some of these tools doesn't necessarily do anything. Like right now using shift with the water erosion tool is the exact same effect as just sculpting it like I normally would. Some things like the smooth tool will actually, if you hold down shift, will add noise instead of smoothing. So I'm actually going to go back to my regular erosion tool. Oh, and noise is exactly what it sounds like. It just adds noise. You can kind of see here when I'm holding down Control and Alt. It's it's good for making areas that are just like really kind of messed up looking. I guess you could make mountains this way fairly easily, I suppose, and increase that tool strength to like 0.25. Um, let's actually just go raise. So here we go. We getting, and this is actually going to work better with a much larger brush. So if I go back to like a 2048 brush, um, we get a lot more variation in the geometry that it creates from there. I'm not a big fan though because you lose a lot of your control. And when I'm sculpting these things, I like to have a lot of control over the final outcome. Because I'm gonna have to place structures on this. I'm gonna have to create areas for the player to walk on, and so it's a lot easier to come in here with an idea of what I want, and just kind of sculpt the living hell out of it. So I'm back on the heat erosion tool. I really really like this tool. It makes some really cool effects. And I mean it definitely makes sculpting mountains a lot easier. Unreal's old system for doing all of this was called Terrain, and Terrain was all right. It had some definite benefits to it, but it wasn't quite as robust as Landscape, and it didn't have nearly as good of tools. You could essentially push and pull and add noise, and that was about it. Uh, and those tools worked fine for what they were, but it wasn't an efficient system, and it wasn't terribly good. It didn't LOD. There were a lot of issues with it, and especially for big, like larger areas. If you were going to do something like an MMO style outdoor area, you probably weren't going to want to use the terrain for that unless you were going to break it up into a number of streaming levels or streaming volumes. Just because it was, like I said, horribly, horribly inefficient. Let's sculpt some more erosion in here. Yeah, I'm really starting to like how this is looking. I feel like I need to come in with my regular brush and kind of add some more detail to this. So we're going to get off the erosion tool. We're going to go back to our circle brush. I'm going to come in here. We'll leave the brush fall off where it's at. I think here I'm going to let's go with tip fall off. We'll leave the tool strength where it's at for the moment. I'm just going to really lightly come in here and start kind of sculpting some of this down. This generally works better if you move in kind of straighter lines from the direction you want the erosion, or for not the erosion, but where you want the sculpting to take place at. So, here on this face, I'm kind of pushing in on all of this, and trying to create some more mountainous features here. We can, yeah, there we go, and do the same thing kind of over here and just kind of push those out a little bit, and then at the same time, or push those in, and at the same time we're going to come over here and pull these ones out and get some of that mountain peak back that I just destroyed. Um, let's come over here and same thing, just kind of add a little bit more. Um, One of the things that I really like to see when I'm doing mountains is, if you look at mountains, and especially from a distance, they don't just terminate into a flat area. They tend to be irregular, and you have areas like this where, um, you might see a mountain that does, something to this effect, where you've got these kind of, I don't know, veins or fingers that come off of them. And these kind of touches are really really nice. Not always necessary. It's always going to depend on the style of game you're working in. It's going to depend on a lot of things like, does the player need to get there? Can they even see it? Um, but there, I think, if it's something the player can get to, if it's definitely something the player can see, those are visual touches that kind of really help sell what it is that this is supposed to be. And it's starting to get a little off the mark here, but this is where we go in and we take our smooth tool, or we can take any of our other tools. Oops, I was holding shift and adding some noise on accident. And here I'm just going to really lightly kind of tap on these areas, get rid of some of that, the places where I'd over sculpted it a little bit. Now we have like some really nice mountain features here. And so, yeah, this is starting to look pretty good. I've got some stretching I want to take care of, so we're gonna do another pass over this. Just kind of keep working at it. Depending on what you're trying to do, this can take a while, and it definitely takes some patience. It's like everything else in game development, but it's just, I don't know. It's kind of nice. This is a very zen experience for me. So let's actually throw just a basic material on here. Oh, I forgot. We gotta go over to manage, and we actually have to pick a material for it. Do, 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 do. Oops. Wait, where is? Oh, okay. At this point, we can't do that anymore. There is a landscape material in here. Let me search for it. Oh, maybe I didn't import it. I could have swore there was an M underscore landscape, but I appear to have been wrong. Huh. Okay, well, we'll get back to that in a minute. I might just have to set up a landscape material for it. So in the meantime, I'm going to get back to sculpting on this. And like making something like this in Maya with the sculpting tools might not take too long, but you are also going to wind up with something that probably has a lot more tries than what we have here to get the same effect, which may not necessarily be a good thing. Although tries are starting to matter a little bit less. Still, you want anything that you're going to use in game, you want to use as efficiently as possible. You don't really want to waste anything if you don't need to. So we're going to work at this a little bit more. Actually, going to give myself more space to work with here. Oh, that didn't work. What the heck, man? There we go. Let's come in here. Kind of keep working at this a little bit. Okay, so I mean, this is kind of just essentially how this process works. But let's do some specifics, some things that people tend to not think about when they initially start sculpting landscapes. So when we're out in the world and we're looking around at things, for example, if you're out hiking in the woods, paths aren't necessarily flat; they're worn, and they're worn by a number of things. They're worn by people, they're worn by animals. And so, for instance, if I wanted to sculpt, let's grab the sculpt tool. Let's drop my brush size to half of that. So nah, we can leave it at 512. This will be fine. So let's say I've got this kind of built up area, and it's built up on both sides of this area that I want the player to walk through. It doesn't really look right if we come in here and we're walking in here and this is just flat. That's always going to look a little weird because the only things in nature that are perfectly 100% flat are man-made. Um, Maybe not the only things, but pretty damn close to it. So one of the things that you're going to want to do is to make areas like this look a little better. And this can wait until you've painted a material on and you've got your material set up. But I like to come in and I'll usually lower my brush down. I'll lower my brush size a little bit. And then I just kind of hold down shift and I just really lightly brush this in. It makes a little bit of an uneven surface. We get something that looks a little bit more natural. And after we come in here and smooth this out a little bit, it's going to look considerably better. So let's just kind of push down a little bit more, get nice and kind of uneven. And because the increments we're moving in here are so small, the the effect the smooth tool has is going to be a little less pronounced than it was in the much larger areas. Although we're still getting a lot of ew. Oh, I was holding down shift. That's why. Things like this take some finesse, and they can just take some time. Let's come in here and get rid of that. I don't like it. Actually, the fastest way to do that would be to take the flatten tool and let's pick a point. We'll just kind of flatten that back out. And I picked a really bad point, apparently. Oop. That's why I didn't actually select the flatten tool. So, all right, let's flatten that back out. Get that a little less built up looking. And come back in and try that again, and a little bit more finesse this time. And actually something like this for the fall off, tip fall off probably isn't our best bet. We probably want smooth or spherical. And you could probably even come in here with something like this is someplace where the hydro erosion tool might actually be really good. In fact, let's just go ahead and give that a try. Places like this are places where water is going to have run through it. It's going to have affected the landscape a little bit. We want to avoid stuff like this, but thankfully that's a pretty easy fix. So now I'm going to grab my heat erosion tool. I'm going to take care of some of these edges here, kind of smooth this out a little bit and give it some of the same effect that we had before. There we go, pushing down. That's starting to look really, really nice. And we got some jagged edges over here. Come in and get rid of some of those jaggy bits. Generally, like there's going to be some temptation to have things be jagged if you want it to look like rock, because it's hard sometimes to tell what that surface is when you're just sculpting on it. But what I would recommend is let your textures do that work for you, or let static meshes do that work for you. What you wind up with otherwise is you wind up with areas where you have like this crease here that just doesn't look natural. And you wind up with like points that don't look natural. Your texture will do a lot of that heavy lifting for you. And so on the one hand, you don't want to smooth it into oblivion, but on the other hand, you want a nicer transition between the faces that you've got viewable. So, here I push those down a little bit and we still have this nice uneven surface, but it's not quite as tessellated as some of these other areas in here, I can just come in here and kind of tap these with the smooth brush to fix them up a little bit, get rid of some of these sharp edges. Um, nice. There we go. And it needs some more work. Let's add some noise to that. Now let's sculpt it back down. And if you can use, or using nice even strokes is going to help. You're going to wind up with less areas of like uneven buildup. So don't try and sketch the paths so much as just try and pull them in one straight line. Because if you're not happy with it, it's a really easy matter to come in and smooth it back out and try again. Although here I want to play with the hydro erosion tool more. See if I can get this to kind of do what I get the effect out of it that I want. There's a fine balance you're going to want to strike between realism and the player and a surface that looks like the player can walk on. And if it's really uneven and like jagged like this, players will go here if they can, but it doesn't necessarily look like a path that they're supposed to take. Um, and so I like to use all of these tools together to get that effect. Let's smooth a little bit. Okay, that tool strength is way too high. Let's actually drop this number down to 1. Let's drop the tool strength down to 0.15. Leave the brush fall off where it's at. And I come here and work on some of these areas. So what I did was I dropped the filter kernel radius, and what that does is it changes what's affected by the smooth brush. So now only small details are affected, and it's going to leave some of the larger details alone. And you can see it's having like a much less pronounced effect on the landscape as I sculpt on it. So really the key to this, like most visual art, is one, to pay attention to your source material. Like I like to have um, whatever kind of terrain I'm trying to sculpt up in, like an image of it in another window while I'm working, so I can kind of refer to that as I'm going. And then also, just patience. This takes some time and it takes some finesse. And yes, things like World Machine can spit out a landscape or terrain for you, but those things are going to take so much work to make usable. Um, and generally, they're going to take a lot of work to set up, and even then, you're going to wind up with something that you still have to do a lot of work on to get exactly what you want out of it. And I'll show you guys what I mean later. Probably in the next couple of days, I'll give a demo on World Machine and importing height maps into Unreal and that entire process. So, something like this, it's starting to become a bit of a nicer path. It's way too big. Like this, 512 is let's see, 100 and I think it's 180 centimeters is about 6 feet if I remember correctly. 183 centimeters is roughly 6 foot, like even. So these units that you see here aren't meaningless units. These are centimeters, although because our landscape's being multiplied by 100 to make it meters, these values are as well. So this is actually a 256-meter wide path that I'm sculpting here. Um, so generally when you're doing these things, you're also going to come in and you'll be testing this. You'll make sure that it works, it looks the way you want, it's the size you want. So I'm going to hit play from here. We're going to come in and look at this. Whoa, that's loud. So these are the mountains we were sculpting, and it looks like they still need some work. There were some areas closer to the ground where my camera wasn't really at eye height, or wasn't at that height that I kind of missed. And so you're going to want to do this a lot. You're going to want to come in and check these things out. You're going to want to make sure that the work you're doing that you're doing it efficiently. So this actually didn't turn out too bad. It's not great, but it kind of got across the idea that I wanted to get across. Um, and it beats the hell out of this flat stuff. This flat stuff's just boring. So that is all I really have for right now. I will post this video on YouTube shortly, and tomorrow, I'm not sure when, but it probably will be during the day and not the evening. We will actually talk about landscape materials and start putting these things together. So we'll add some materials to this. We'll sculpt a little bit more. Oh, this is gonna hurt. Oh, hey, no, it didn't. Surfing. And we'll play with this a little bit more. Although if you want to keep watching, I'm probably just going to keep sculpting because I really enjoy doing this, and I want to fix some of these issues we saw. And just for fun, I might do some other stuff like add some paths up the side of this mountain, even though it looked like I could just charge right up it, which I was hoping to avoid. I'm actually going to bring my brush back up in size and just keep refining this and build this back up, make it a little bit more impassable. Because nobody, unless you're a superhero, should have been able to charge up that mountain quite like that. Although, to be fair, the more I build this up, the more when I get the erosion tools or the smoothing tools, the more it's going to smooth it back down. So it's kind of a constant fight between what you want it to look like um, and the size you want it to be. Ooh, this is gross. Let's do something about that. Ooh, that is also gross. And how about let's get back to the erosion tool. It's just an all-around better tool. And watch out around the edges of your landscape. They sometimes will get kind of funky. I like to sculpt around them or sculpt them down so that it's less apparent that that's an edge. Generally, based on the size of what you're doing, you're probably going to block most of that off anyway, so that players can't see it. It's a pet peeve of mine. It just kind of bothers me. All right, and let's just keep going. Smooth out some of those jaggier bits. And again, I'm basically doing away with some of the work that I did, but look at what it's turning into, and you can kind of see that it's a lot like building up clay on an object so that you have more to work with, and then kind of taking away what you don't need. In fact, that's exactly what it's like, especially with clay brush turned on, which is part of why it's so awesome. It just makes for really, really nice landscape in really nice looking environments. And honestly, when you get into the fine tuning stage, when you're doing things like little paths, turning off clay brush might be helpful. You get less buildup and a little bit more of an even distribution of the landscape mass. Ew, gross. Let's fix this. I don't like that at all. There we go. That's looking good again. I mean, it's not great. It still needs some work. This area up here is still a bit of a mess, and by working on the back side of this, we can actually improve how the front of it looks. Give it some smooth smoothness on the back so that there, nice. There we go. All right, we're getting there. Still got a ways to go. I don't really need to worry too much about what the backside looks like here because the player would never see this. Mostly what I'm doing here is all this is reducing the amount of stretching in between the front and the back, and so it'll allow me a little bit better sculpting on the front side of this that the player would actually be able to see. All right, nice. All right, let's take care of this bit here. Okay, so that's actually looking pretty good. It needs some more work at the top. We got some pretty jagged bits up here, but that's nothing a quick hit of the smooth tool can't fix. And here I'm just kind of, this part I'm using the mouse and I'm just kind of lightly clicking rather than holding it down. I don't want to smooth all the detail out, but I do want to get rid of some of those really tessellated bits because they just don't look very natural. Mountain peaks don't look that way. All right, that's looking good. So, a quick recap. To create a landscape, you go to the landscape in your modes tab. Um, you Let's actually just go ahead and make a new one. Um, Move this out here. So when you're when you're creating a new one, you have your location, rotation, and scale. Leave these alone for the most part when you first start. Remember your section size, your sections per component, your number of components, and overall resolution. And then just go to town sculpting. Keep in mind also the game type and what you're doing. Some things aren't going to need as big a change in elevation as others, and sometimes you're just going to use a landscape as a test bed to have something to run around on that's more visually interesting than, like, let's say, a cube. So, anyway, y'all have a good night, and tomorrow I'll announce when the next stream's going to start. It's probably going to be during the day. I'm going to assume between 2 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we will go ahead and create a basic landscape material. I'll teach you about landscape layer blending, and then we can paint some actual texture detail on a landscape. So everybody have a good night and thank you for watching.